I've been posting some really cool pictures that I've been able to capture, and it's all because of her style and just wanting to always explore new tactics and new ways to do things. So, you guys ready? It's gonna be great. You ready to go? Oh, and also feel free to ask questions as well. Whenever, I will try to make sure that I am being mindful to look at them at any moment. All right, so just kind of wanted to dive into overall file management as well. Some things that I know a lot of people have asked me is like, how do you go through all of your photos and kind of figure out which ones you like? A lot of people do go through Lightroom and upload all of their photos right onto Lightroom specifically. Me, I don't really like doing that. I feel like it's a little too hectic and a little too crazy. So instead, I just bring it right into Finder, and then using all of the little labels and tags and things like that, kind of go through and pick out which ones I want to then bring into Lightroom and then modify it from there. So let's hop right into Lightroom right now. And I kind of just picked a random picture, so I hope it's not, hope it's one that you guys would actually want to see edited. Cool, I'm gonna hop right out of here for 1 second and kind of show you guys a bit of this file management. So here's all of the photos from this photo shoot that I labeled to then bring into Lightroom. And from there you can label and do whatever you need to. You can put stars on them and tag different ones. For me, my process, I try to make sure that I go through each one of them, create like a basis for like a preset for each one of them, and then I just simply copy and paste all of those presets over to every single one of those photos. So you can kind of see that every one of them has a varying degree of simplicity and a bit of a cinematic appeal to it. And that's what we're going to dive into a little bit today and just kind of figure out what that style looks like and what are some specific things that I really enjoy editing, and what that looks like for me. Also, keep in mind, a little background on myself. I have no formal training in Photoshop or in Lightroom or anything like that. I took like a high school class at one point, but I don't really count that. So a lot of this stuff, like, I am sure that there are better ways to do it than what I do, and I'm definitely learning. So if you have any tips or tricks or techniques that you think would really be helpful to me, please reach out to me because that would be great. Cool. So for this specific photo, if you go right into the settings for that photo. So this was in RAW. So I shoot RAW and JPEG, and a lot of these specific techniques are I do have some presets that I use within camera as well that kind of changed a little bit of that white balance. I think my white balance was set at 4,300 or something like that for this. I'm not 100% sure. I kind of messed around with it throughout the shoot. So yeah, so this was right out of camera. And what we will get to is final product. So this is final product. So you'll see right here that there's actually 3 different files. The first file is the original form, the original file. This is what I was working with when I first brought it into Lightroom. Then the second one is actually the Lightroom file. So this is from all of the techniques and all of the different tweaks that I made to make it look like I wanted people to see, like I saw in my mind. But then what a lot of people don't do, which I tend to do more often, is I then bring every single picture that I want to tweak a little bit more into Lightroom, or into Photoshop rather. So you can kind of see a little bit of a difference there between Photoshop and Lightroom. There's not a ton of a difference. And a lot of that is just lighting techniques and lighting effects within Photoshop. So that's kind of why I bring it into Lightroom. Anyway, I'm going to stop my rambling there and go right into editing this photo. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that one more time. Cool. And I'm going to move that one from the stack. Cool. All right, clean slate. All right, so normally what I'll do is I actually start off using, going into color profiles and kind of picking out a little bit of what I'd want this to look like right after raw. So for this specific one, I actually used a vintage preset that was vintage 06. So you can kind of see it brings down those blacks a little bit more, or brings up those blacks rather. Kind of adds a little bit of a fade to all of the shadows, and just makes it have this really nice soft appeal that I really enjoy in photos. If you followed me on some of my Instagram, you kind of see that I have a little bit of a cinematic style. So a lot of that actually is just playing with the shadows. If you notice, almost none of my pictures have true black. And pretty much what that means is that all of the blacks are more faded. So how I do that is I would normally just put on a profile or something like that. But if you were to just take off one of those profiles and go back to the original file, a lot of that you can actually just do manually. So normally what I will start off with is just playing around with those shadows. I try to stay away from the first few little toggles up at the top, because I feel like a lot of people just dive right into boosting up that exposure, bringing down those blacks, and like really playing a little too harshly with the light, at least from my perspective. But I think with the point curve, what I tend to do is I'll bring up those shadows. So this little point here, bring up those shadows, and then I actually bring them back down. So it immediately gives it a little bit more of a dramatic appeal. But what I don't like about this photo now is that those highlights are a little too blaring. So I actually do the same thing, create an S-curve, bring down the shadow, or bring down the highlights, and pump them back up. And now those mid-tones are a little too bright within her arm, so I actually will bring down that light as well. So immediately you kind of see that this looks significantly different. So that's before, and that's after, then, and that is just playing with the curves. So you can actually do a lot with just these curves. It immediately gives it a bit of a cinematic appeal. A nice film look, super sweet and nice. So for this specific photo, I wanted to really lean into those greens and those oranges a little bit more. So I bumped up the yellows a tad, kind of give it a little bit more of a warm feel and glow. And then I actually brought down those greens a teeny tiny bit. Yeah. So you do want to make sure that you are playing with them just in the tiniest bits. You don't want to have your magentas blazing or anything like that. So then what I'll normally do is go right into your color mixer. What's really neat about Lightroom is you kind of get this little tool that you're able to click on a specific color and adjust the saturation, the luminance, or the hue, as well as your highlight, shadows, and midtones. So I normally don't really play around with this tool too much in the ways of your curves, but rather in these colors, I really like to boost up those greens a little tiny bit so that they have a little bit more of a softer, glowing appeal to them. And then bring up those highlights a little tiny bit while also not losing her skin tone. Cool. So then for this specific photo, something that I really wanted to highlight was that directional lighting coming in from above the trees at the top over here. So all of this lighting was all natural. I had no other lights besides just the sun and a camera, and that's pretty much it. That I didn't really have any other tools or anything like that. And of course a ton of candles. And don't worry, we did take the wax off of that rock over here too. Be friendly to our environment. Cool. So, some other things that I tend to do with other photos, for this one I'll probably kind of keep it pretty simple, because I don't really want to play around too much with it without it looking a little too unnatural or anything like that. But what I will also do is play around with the saturation. So normally on a lot of my pictures is I'll actually bump up that saturation a tiny bit, but also bring down the vibrance. So the vibrance will kind of create a bit more of those highlighted textures, and I don't tend to like those highlights as much, because I want to keep those shadows and highlights as even as possible, while also kind of creating a nice soft look and glow about it. I tend not to do anything too dramatic in the sense of lighting, but that's normally overall, if you were to take anything away from this specific tutorial, it is that lighting is so important, especially in your edit. While you can do it all on location, being mindful to where the light is and where it's directionally casting onto your subject is incredibly important. Creates this nice cinematic appeal while also bringing eyes directly to where you want your audience to look. So right now I think this is pretty much to the point where I would want it within Lightroom. I'm going to bring down those oranges just a tiny bit. I don't want her to be looking like an Oompa Loompa or anything crazy. So some other things that I would do on some other photos, which I didn't really do in here, is I bring down that clarity a bit to kind of give her skin a little bit more of a softer approach. If she is kind of portraying this fantasy character, I want to make sure that she is looking as soft and subtle as possible. What I also did with this one is so in your color mixer, the oranges, I actually brought up that luminance a little tiny bit, so that actually gave it a little bit more of that directional light appeal, and it looks like there's a light on her, but there really is not. By just bringing up those oranges, that luminance a little bit. And I also kind of did the same with the yellows, a teeny tiny bit, and you can kind of see that change within the candles itself. Cool. So, last but not least, that is when I go up to what most people would actually start with, your exposure, color, shadows, all those different things. What people don't realize, or things that I'm starting to realize myself, is that the highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks are actually not really in concordance to your point curve. So it is great to play around with this contrast first. So I would tend to bring up the contrast just a tiny bit on this one. Normally I actually brought the contrast down, but for this one I really wanted to lean into those blacks that are right behind her. So it creates, again, the lighting techniques, creates this great cascade of light that starts at the top over here. So my eyes immediately go right to her, for me at least, my eyes immediately go right to her head, but then to her hands that lead up to this corner over here, and then back down into this black space and loops right back around. So my eyes immediately have this circular motion that keeps me right on the subject. So that's exactly where I want it to be. Cool. So I'm going to bring up those blacks just a tiny bit over here because I don't really want it to look too dark nighty. I still want her to be super light, super soft, super airy. The difference between whites and highlights, that one's super interesting. So highlights, you can kind of see it here. Highlights tend to be a little bit more harsh, and especially in this picture. I actually tend to bring down those highlights, bring up the shadows, then bring up the whites, and then down the blacks. So the whites will kind of make everything have a little bit of like an ambient type of appeal, while the blacks, you can kind of bring those down or up or wherever you want to go on those ones too. So for me, I tend to bring down the highlights, up the shadows, bring up the whites, and then down the blacks. So I know it sounds super crazy and super weird, but that's just where I tend to start off. So for me, Lightroom is kind of a place for me to get it to a point where I'm like, okay, this is what I would hope I could see within camera. And of course, everything's going to be a little bit different outside of camera. Diving into some other tools that we could use in Lightroom, but I'm not going to use for this specific one. There are some other tools. You have your healing tool, of course, is great. She doesn't have anything kind of crazy on her at all that I would want to touch up. So I will just leave her there. Then you also have, your brush tool. So that adds specific edits. So your exposures, your contrasts within a brush. So I can actually bring just her down by just using that brush. Same thing with your linear gradient, has those same effects within a gradient tool, and then a radial gradient as well. Same sort of idea. Cool, so I'm happy with this within Lightroom. I hope you guys are, because we're about to move on. So if you right click, go into Edit Photoshop, this will bring it right into Photoshop, and this is kind of where I tend to get a little crazy and spend the majority of my time. What's nice about working within Lightroom is I can then take all of these settings and just copy and paste them onto all of the other photos that look the same. Hopping right over to Photoshop. Cool. Great. So, within Photoshop, normally, I would actually not start off with this specific technique, but for this one specifically, I wanted to make sure that I was really honing in on those lights. So what I went and did is you have to go ahead and change it to an 8-bit channel, and then go to Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. And this is what I do with pretty much all of my photography. I like to play around with lighting on set, and then also in post as well. So immediately you already see that it's kind of already gotten a bit darker of an appeal. So toggling on and off that preview button, this is what it looks like before we added any sort of lighting effects, before I even showed you guys what that looks like. And toggling back on. So cool. So my normal setup within lighting effects, Photoshop does save all of these settings. Of course, if you clear your cache, or if you wanted to restart Photoshop, then you would have to create these settings all over again. So for me, what I created was one singular point light, which you can kind of see is actually humongous for this specific one. So, and that was actually because some of the other ones that I had, it started to create this really strange gradient within the photo itself. So you actually saw the light beams, which was a little weird. So I made it huge so you wouldn't be able to see that. But so for my setup, I normally have a point light and then 2 spotlights. So point light will just create an overall key light type of appeal. While then you have kind of like fill lights in the back. And so these spotlights, you have a hot spot in the center, and then everything around is pretty much acts as like a feathered gradient from the hot spot. So normally with a lot of my photos, I will play around with these types of things. And you can kind of see, it's a little hard to notice right now because I'm moving it around a little too much. So right here, this line is the hot spot. So you can see that it's a little bit darker within here, and then it kind of fades out into a lighter appeal. For this specific photo, I kind of had it a little bit more of everything is within that hot spot. But for the sake of this tutorial, let's go ahead and change it around so I can show you guys what I did to make it a little bit different. So what I didn't like about this specific one, this specific spotlight, was that it created this vignette that I really didn't want to have within the photo. I didn't really want it to look too storybook-like, but I wanted it to look like a fantasy world in some sort of way. So what I needed to do is then bring out that that light so that it wasn't creating those harsh blacks within the corners. Cool. Great. So I now have 3 lights. I have the point light. Again, it's just overall ambience and general vibe. Then the spotlight coming in from the left, and then I have another one coming in from the right. A lot of my photos, they are not normally this large, but for the sake of just trying to keep them, keep that gradient satisfied within those corners, I made them a little bit bigger just so they weren't creating some weird harsh effects that I really didn't like. So now that we have all 3 of these lights kind of set up in the ways that we want it to be set up, you're not going to go into each one of these lights and you can change the colors. So you have a colorize button and then a color button. Overall color is just creating color within the hotspot. And then your colorize is creating pretty much like a contrast of a color. So for this specific one, I kind of stuck with a little bit more of those reds. I wanted to lean into them a little bit more. But for the sake of this live chat, live stream, I want to bring in a little bit more of those oranges. So it's over in the whites right now, but you can see as we move those, so we move it around, it immediately changes that color. You can change the intensity and things like that, which normally I don't really touch it too often, if I'm going to be honest. But it just kind of plays around with those highlights a little bit more. Yeah. So I'm happy with that, as that is. Kind of gives it a little bit more of that glowing sort of appeal. But it is a little dark, so I'm not a huge fan of that. So I'm going to bring up that white color a little bit. And then possibly bring down the ambience a little bit. You can immediately see it creates a little bit more of that softer glow. And that color's a little too harsh for me as well. You can see right on her shoulder that highlight is a bit much. So I'm actually going to go right into those oranges again. And bring down that intensity of that orange. Cool. Great. Sweet. So I'm pretty happy with how this point light looks. You can kind of see that it transferred all of those yellows, all of those oranges, all throughout those greens, creating this really nice golden appeal. And this day, actually this specific photo, the sun was pretty much gone at this point. So a lot of this golden appeal is all within just these lighting effects specifically. So going into these highlights and these spotlights, You can see that this is kind of where I was before while I was editing these pictures outside of the stream. I wanted to bring in a little bit more of those yellows, so leaning away from those oranges and those reds to protect her skin tones a little bit more. I wanted to bring in a little bit more of those yellows, kind of pop out those candles a little bit more. And you can actually go ahead and eyedrop select a specific color if you wanted to, and that will just select that color within the color wheel. I don't really tend to do that too often because I want it to interact a little bit differently. So I'm going to bring up those yellows a little bit more. Because I don't like how orange she's looking in her legs and in her arms. It's a little too much for my taste. So I'm going to actually bring out a little less of that color. And I think that looks good to me. So you can see that actually changed the color up here. You can increase that, give it a little bit more of that gold, nice saturated appeal. And then for your color, gotta just watch out for those highlights a little bit. You don't want those to be blown out. And then just for the sake of bringing it a little bit brighter, mess around with that ambient lighting as well. And this one, I actually tend to not play with this one too often, just because I like to kind of keep this one a little darker. So within this corner, you'll see that the ambience is kind of down quite a bit, so that my eyes bounce off of this corner immediately. I don't really want to go into this corner. I want to go right back to her where she's pointing up to the light, and then it brings it right back down, cascading onto her face. But I am going to bring down those highlights just a little bit, bring down that color, and then bring up the overall color of this specific spotlight. And I'm actually going to decrease that hot spot a little tiny bit. Cool. All right, so I'm pretty happy with how this looks for lighting. Now, if we're going to toggle on and off our preview, so this is with the lighting, that is without. You can immediately see that your eyes immediately go right towards her, while without it, your eyes kind of go to the outskirts. It's creating like a natural lighting vignette, which is great. I don't really like to mess around with too many vignettes, so just being able to naturally light that is really killer for me. And that's kind of my big quote-unquote secret. A lot of people I've found don't even know that these lighting techniques work or even exist. So I'm almost done with this picture. I'm super happy with how it looks, but I also want to contour her a little bit more. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go right into this burn tool, set this over to shadows as it is right now, and I lowered down this exposure quite a bit. If you toggle onto brush, and normally what I'll do is just lean into those shadows a little tiny bit more, creating a little bit more definition underneath her chin and under her arm as well. I think that looks great. I'm going to do the same to her legs, kind of creating a little bit more again of that light, making sure that the audience kind of knows where that light is coming from while also not being distracting. So I feel like this also kind of brings out a little bit more of those shadows, which I really enjoy. Cool. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but with highlights. So I switched over to the dodge tool, went over to highlights. The exposure is up a little bit higher than what I would like it to be, so I'm going to bring that down a tad bit more. And then play around with those highlights on her face. You do have to be a little careful with this because it does tend to bring up the saturation of specific hot spots. So you don't want to play around with it too much. But what this does is just kind of give her a little bit more of a definition. I like to accentuate those collarbones a little bit more, give a little bit more of like a feminine type of appeal. And same thing with her forearms, kind of making sure that that light is bouncing off right onto her forearm. Same thing with the legs. It's really minute, but I feel like really gives a bit of a pop and a bit of a detail that a lot of photos I feel like can be missing. So I want to make sure that this is what I see in my mind is what you're getting. Cool. I'm going to go back over to the burn tool one more time. I'm going to bring down those midtones a little bit. You can see that these oranges are a little too hot. So I'm going to bring those down a tad bit. And then sometimes what I'll do, although I tend to not really like to do it, I'll actually go into this sponge tool and I'll desaturate some of those oranges. And immediately just kind of makes my eyes a little more comfortable with looking at those oranges. Cool. Great. All right, so overall, I think this looks great. I normally wouldn't really do too much more to this specifically. With some other photos, I really would. But I will say for some of these, what I actually did do, and this specific photo doesn't have a ton of it because of just overall direction of this specific spot. But you can kind of see in this corner there are some there's some sky there, and for me that's super distracting and I really didn't like that at all. So what I'm gonna go do is gonna take my healing tool and just punch all of that shadow or all of that sky out of there. Now this does kind of create a weird pattern sometimes. For this one I think that's fine, but for the sake of this conversation, the moment that there is a weird pattern, what I'll do is actually switch over to my stamp tool just by clicking S in any sort of keyboard shortcut, just the default keyboard shortcut. Then pressing Option to select an area, and that will bring over any sort of foliage or anything like that that I want to cover up a specific area. And like I said, for this specific photo, I really didn't do too much to the sky in this area, but actually on a lot of other photos, I took out the sky completely just because I thought it was really distracting. For me, I really want to make sure that the subject is being highlighted more than anything else. And when that sky is just blazing out there, I really think that's distracting. So cool. I'm also going to go right into these images, the image adjustments, and I'm going to play around with the, let's bring it into the curve. So you can do the same thing that you would do in Lightroom. Actually, I don't know if you guys know of the camera raw feature, but if you were to do, I think it's Command Shift A, it's a filter that actually brings up this camera raw profile, and you can play around with all of these different things that you would play around with in Lightroom as well. I feel like it's a little bit more simple, a little more intuitive to work with in Lightroom than it is in Photoshop, but what Photoshop has above Lightroom in this specific sense is these little tools here. So I can actually bring up those highlights and change the color of those highlights. So if I really wanted her to be super orange, I can bring in some oranges just in the highlights alone. But because for me, these highlights are actually a little too orange, I'm actually going to add a little bit of blue to that just to kind of give that complementary color. And you can already tell that it kind of gives a little bit more of that natural lighting. And for the shadows, just to kind of add a little contrast, I'm going to add some orange within the shadows. Now it's a little too orange, so I'm going to balance it out a little bit. Bring up those greens a little bit more. And maybe move that over to more of like a teal instead. Cool. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that as it is. But she is still a little orange. So I'm actually just going to play around with those oranges a little bit. Maybe bring her into more of those reds. And then play around with those reds to make her a little bit more orange, which I know sounds strange, but it works. Cool. So also what's really cool, what I really like about this Camera Raw feature is they have amazing presets that I think are incredible. And so normally if I have like 1 or 2 photos that I want to edit, I'm not going to bring it into Lightroom. I'm going to go right into Photoshop. And then I'll immediately go right into these presets and then play around with the presets from there. For me, one of my favorite ones is the soft mist, which right now it looks absolutely awful on this specific picture. But what the soft mist does is it brings up those shadows, hones in on those details so that you're able to kind of see what you're looking at. And then from there, I'll actually play around with the S-curve or the point curve. Cool. Looks great. And she's still a little too vibrant for me, so I'm actually going to bring down her vibrance just a teeny tiny tad. And then those highlights are a little blazing, so I'm going to bring down those highlights as well. You can kind of see that in her skirt. You're getting all of that detail back at the moment that we take out those highlights, but now she's a little too dark, so I'm actually going to bring up those whites a little bit. So you're still going to lose a little bit of that detail on the dress, but it brings up her face a lot more while also not blazing on her forehead with that directional light. Cool. And what's also awesome is, of course, you can toggle on and off between black and white or color. So if you wanted to see what your image would look like in black and white without going through and actually changing the image, you can just hop right on into that specific area. Cool. So now that this is done, I'm going to hit OK. It'll transfer all of those back into Photoshop. And now what's really cool is Photoshop and Lightroom are connected, so I don't have to save this Photoshop file. What I'm going to do is just do Command S. It'll save it as a TIFF. I can go right ahead and X out of that, and then go right back over to Lightroom. And you can see now it has a little number tag on it. And if I'm to click into here, this is what it looks like before Photoshop, and that's what it looks like afterwards. So you can kind of see that directional lighting's a lot more focused within on her face. Those oranges aren't as blazing, and her forehead isn't as crazy or anything like that. Cool. Yeah, so this picture is done for me. Most of the time I say that it's done and then sleep on it and come back and tweak it a little bit more, and then go from there. Sometimes I'll actually go right into this Photoshop export and then tweak it within Lightroom a little bit more. Cool. If you guys have any questions, feel free to go ahead and shoot it up into the live chat. Saw that Michael posted and said on the brush tool, once I went to a different tab and back to the brush tool tab, it seemed like the control resets to defaults after a new set of brush strokes. Is there a way to edit the previous edits? Yes. So in Lightroom, if you go to that brush tool that Michael was talking about, essentially if I wanted to use this brush tool on her, so it's not going to have anything crazy right now. Let's just bring down the exposure. So pretty much what he's saying is that when he uses this brush tool and then he wants to add another one, at least, I mean, Michael, if you're still there, of course, let me know if I'm wrong, but you would add another brush and that would create a different exposure. So let's go ahead and mess around with the exposure over here, just completely destroy the image. But now I'm seeing, okay, well, her exposure over here is a little too dark, so I actually want to edit this brush, but now that this has been re-edited to constitute this brush, you can't really quite do that. Unless you click on this blue dot, and you'll see it immediately went back to the old brush. So you just got to click on that blue dot, and I can now mess around with the exposure in that specific brush. So yeah. Cool. Can also go ahead and delete a brush too, just by clicking on that blue dot yet again and selecting delete. Not that one, just this one. No, never mind. So yeah. Struggle a little bit with these brushes. Cool. All right. Anyone else have any other questions? Are we Gucci? If not, that's great. Thank you guys for tuning in, and super excited to let you guys into a little bit of my tips and tricks and secrets. Again, if you guys have any thoughts or ideas or techniques that you guys like to use that I do not use, please let me know. I'm always looking to learn new things and experience different techniques in order for me to do the same things that I like to do, or something that you honestly, even if you didn't like something about this image, I would love to see what you guys got going on as well. I am looking to do another one of these at some point in the near future, so if you guys would like to see it or would like to be notified, feel free to shoot me a message with your email address, and I'll go ahead and throw you into a newsletter system, and I'll send you a link directly. That way you don't have to always be thinking about it as well. If you guys liked it, please feel free to let me know. I would love to hear any feedback, any comments, what you think I could improve on, what you really enjoyed about it. And yeah, that'll be great. Thanks guys. I will talk with you soon. Peace out.